Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Just see everyone coming into Zoom now. So it's just gone 12:30 p.m. UK time. So I'm just going to give everyone a chance to join. Feel free to drop into the Q&A box and say hi. We've disabled the chat feature as we've discovered it can cause issues for some people using screen readers. So yeah, please say hi in the Q&A box and let us know where you're joining us from today. So I can see that nearly everyone has arrived now. So I'm glad you could all make it. So we're going to make a start. So hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on WCAG 2.2, an overview of the new accessibility guidelines. I'm Kelly Chan, digital marketing executive at AbilityNet today. So we have the pleasure of being joined by my colleagues Alice and Taylor and Claire Poste, who will take you through the web content accessibility guidelines updates, the new criteria, and how it impacts you and your customers. So before we get started, I'll just run through a few bits of housekeeping. We're joined today by my Clear Text, who'll be providing live captions. So you can join, you can turn on the captions using the CC options on the control panel in Zoom. Additional captions are also available via streamtext.net/player?event=AbilityNet. The slides and transcript and recording of this webinar will be available in a couple of days on our website at abilitynet.org.uk/WCAG 2.2-webinar. If you have any technical questions and you need, or if you just need us at all, please use the Q&A box. And if you need to leave early, don't worry, you'll receive an email in a couple of days' time with the recording transcript and slides, or you can reach out to your sales representative as well. So depending on how you've joined the webinar today, as mentioned, you'll find the Q&A window, so ask us any questions. And Claire and Alice will also be doing Q&A session throughout the webinar today, so please use that to ask them questions. Any unanswered questions as well, we'll hopefully be able to answer them on our webinar page in a couple of days' time. So please feel free to leave feedback in the post-webinar survey. But yeah, we'll get started. So just a little bit about AbilityNet. First of all, so many of you will know who we are, but just in case, we're a charity that supports disabled adults and older people to use technology to achieve their goals at home, at work and in education. We do this by providing free resources and specialist services to help businesses and public sector organisations build more accessible and inclusive workplaces, websites and apps. Our vision is a digital world accessible to all. So I'm just going to start with a couple of polls to find out a bit more about you all. So just before we begin the webinar content. So if we could just launch the first poll, please. So please could you just let us know, who do we have here today? What's your job title? So the options are accessibility tester, software developer, UX/UI designer, product manager or other. If it's other, please let us know in the Q&A section of Zoom, or if you can't access the poll, please just pop your answer in Q&A. Fabulous, I can see those being answered. I'll give it a few more seconds. Fabulous. If we could just end the poll and share the results. Fabulous. So today we have 13% of you are accessibility testers, 13% of you are software developers, 12% UX and UI designers, 9% product manager, and 53% other. So in the Q&A, we've got digital director, digital learning designer, user researcher. Amazing. So welcome. Thanks for joining us today. And just another poll quickly on how much do you know about the WCAG 2.2 update. So if we could just launch that poll, please. So the options are a lot, some, a little, or nothing at all. And again, you can tell us more in detail in the Q&A section of Zoom. So I'll let that run just for a few seconds. Fabulous. So we could close the poll and share the results. So how much do you know about WCAG 2.2 update? We've got 3% saying a lot, very confident, 20% saying some, 31% saying a little, and 46% saying nothing at all. So thank you for sharing in the poll. Fabulous. So thanks everyone. And now, we'll get into the discussion and the main content of today's webinar. So I'm going to hand you over to my colleagues, Alice and Claire. So over to you, Alice and Claire.
Thanks, Kelly, and welcome everyone. I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Alice Taylor. I'm a Principal Accessibility Consultant Team Leader at AbilityNet, where I've worked for around 4 years now. But prior to AbilityNet, I worked as a front-end developer where I was involved with implementing a lot of the WCAG requirements in the code. And now in my current role, I work a lot with the standards and really love seeing that crossover with writing quality code and accessibility and usability. Over to you, Claire.
And I'm Claire Poste, and I'm a Senior Accessibility Consultant at AbilityNet, working with Alice quite a lot, especially recently on WCAG 2.2. So I've been with AbilityNet for just over a year. Before that, I was working at BT in their accessibility team, and my background all the way back when I started was in kind of traditional publishing, which then moved to online publishing, online education, which was essentially where I started learning about accessibility. I've been working accessibility probably for about 5 years now, on and off. So as Alice says, we do a lot of stuff at AbilityNet in our particular area around auditing, training. I work with other colleagues to deliver the digital accessibility remember what it's called, the digital accessibility mapping to improve the maturity of your organisation in terms of digital accessibility. And recently I've been doing a lot of work on the new WCAG 2.2 guidelines, and hopefully we can transfer some of those 46 people who say they know nothing into a couple of extra percentage on, you know, at least a little, hopefully some, by the end of this hour and a half.
Thanks very much, Claire. So you should now be able to see my outline. Do let me know if you can't see it. Today what we're going to be talking about is firstly the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, otherwise known as WCAG. We're going to be looking in depth at the new WCAG 2.2 success criteria, and we'll be talking about specifically the A and the AA requirements. And then we'll also be looking a bit at beyond 2.2. So just some things for you to think about that go kind of beyond the new success criteria. And as Kelly already mentioned, we will be there are lots of opportunities to ask questions. Do feel free to ask them throughout, particularly when we're talking about the success criteria, and we'll try to answer as many as we can as we go. So firstly, what is WCAG? So this is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it is a recommendation created by the World Wide Web Consortium. And it sits alongside the HTML and CSS specification, and it is the standard for creating accessible content. It is also internationally recognised and considered the gold standard for web accessibility. And it's also used as the standard for some legislation. So the UK public sector bodies, websites and mobile applications accessibility regulations 2018 and the European Accessibility Act of 2025. You may, if you are working with them, you may be familiar with that this is the standard for them. There's also 3 compliance levels, which are A, AA and AAA. And the way it works is kind of like a pyramid. So level A is the bottom. If you wanted to meet AA, you have to meet everything in A and everything in AA. And if you want to meet AAA, you need to meet everything in A, everything in AA, and everything in AAA as well. The usual target is AA, and this is also what's often specified in legislation. And this is considered an achievable level of compliance. AAA can be quite subjective, and it can also be quite difficult to achieve for some organisations. So the guidelines are broken down into 4 key principles, and these are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And what these are, so perceivable looks at criteria that ensures that can the content be perceived. So for example, do images and multimedia have appropriate alternatives? Is any information communicated through colour alone? Operable covers criteria around can the content actually be operated? So your users may be using a mouse, or they may be using a keyboard or a switch device. However a user is choosing to access your content, they should be able to operate it. And also it looks at things like, do users have enough time to complete tasks, for example? And understandable looks at, can the content be understood? So are things like errors and instructions clear? Does it work predictably? And is the language of the page set? And finally, robust. So this looks at, is it built to recognise standards? So does it work as expected? And are those standards being met? These principles are also split down into 13 guidelines, and the 2.2 requirement has 86 success criteria as part of that. And just a brief history of WCAG. So WCAG 2.1 was actually released in May 1999. And this contained 14 guidelines with 64 checkpoints. It did have the A, AA and AAA structure that I just mentioned. But the focus of it was very much on HTML, and some of the example success criteria in this included things like providing text alternatives, and it's quite focused on physical disabilities at this point. Then move forward to 2008, sorry, and WCAG 2.0 was released, and with this came big changes. So this is where the 4 principles were introduced. And there were big changes in technology as well, and this was reflected in those guidelines. So at this point, it applies to all digital content, not just HTML, and there was a big increase in the number of disabilities and impairments that were covered by the guidelines. Then if we move forward to 2018, so WCAG 2.1 was released in June 2018, and this built upon the requirements of 2.0. We still had those 4 principles. We had the 13 guidelines, and if you already complied with, if you complied with 2.1, then you'd also comply with 2.0 because it was backward compatible. So the key difference here was that there was more criteria getting added to the requirements. Some of the changes that were added, again, it was because of more advancements in technology. But there was also criteria which helped to benefit users with low vision, cognitive and mobile users as well. And then finally, WCAG 2.2, the most recent update. This was released in October 2023, very recently. Again, this works, so it builds upon 2.1, so there's new criteria being added. Again, it is backward compatible, except for one difference, which is that 4.1.1 parsing has been removed. But the improvements here were for people with cognitive impairments, low vision and mobility disabilities as well. So what's actually new in 2.2? So we can see that there's 2 new A level success criteria. We've got 4 new AA success criteria and 3 new AAA success criteria. As I just mentioned, parsing was removed, and this is because there are advancements in standards and technology, including things like HTML, browsers and assistive technology. So what this has meant that that any issues that would fail the parsing requirement would also fail other criteria. So for example, 1.3.1 info and relationships and 4.1.2 name role value. 4 of the new success criteria that were added focused on cognitive and learning disabilities. 3 of the new success criteria focused on low vision, and 2 have focused on enhancing accessibility for those with mobility disabilities. So as I mentioned before, we're going to be talking through the A and the AA criteria today. Some of them will look at how you can go about testing them. Others will do some demos of, and some will look at some examples and discussions on if they'd actually pass or fail with those examples. So I'll now hand you over to Claire, who will talk about the first criteria.
Hi, Alice. Are you able to stop sharing? Because it won't let me
Yes, of
share
course.
whilst you are.
There we go.
Thank you. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen. Let me know if you can't. So the first success criteria we're going to look at is a relatively straightforward one. It's called Focused Not Obscured, and there are actually 2 versions of this success criteria: Focused Not Obscured Minimum, which is a AA standard, and then Focused Not Obscured Enhanced, which is AAA. We're going to obviously focus on the AA standard today, but just to let you know that there is an enhanced version of this, that if you wanted to, you know, kind of gold star it on Focused Not Obscured, you could absolutely aim for that AAA version. So the point of Focused Not Obscured, the actual text says when a user interface component receives keyboard focus, excuse me, the component is not entirely hidden due to author created content, which essentially means when something receives keyboard focus, it can at least partially be seen there isn't something in front of it. And as you can see in the screenshot I've got on this slide, this is an example from LinkedIn whereby the blue box around the LinkedIn news item, which starts with breakfast. I'm not sure what breakfast they're talking about on LinkedIn, and then in front of it, there is a messaging pop-up which partially obscures that link. So this particular example would actually pass this criteria because you can see that, you know, focus is not completely obscured. The item's not completely obscured. So the key thing about this is that it essentially helps people who only use a keyboard or a lot of assistive technologies who which work via the keyboard interface to see where they are on the page at all times, which is obviously quite essential. So this is a success criteria that only applies to desktop. It's not something that applies on mobile. So if you're testing, you're only looking at desktop. And one of the kind of key things that you're looking at in terms of blocking is kind of, as we see, a messaging pop-up, a cookie banner, a sticky footer or a sticky header. If the one key thing to say is that if the component can be moved around so that you can move it so that it's not blocking the focused item, then only the initial position of the kind of blocking component is relevant. So even if you can move it, if it's blocking that focused item to start off with completely, then it would still fail. The difference between this and the AAA version is that the AAA version means that you can't have any kind of overlap between the two. The focused item has to be fully visible. So that's kind of the difference between the two compliance levels. We're going to have a quick look at a couple of examples, one good example, one not so good example. I have no idea if there are people from the companies that I'm going to use. It's just using as examples. There's absolutely no judgment on the part of us for any of the companies that we're looking at. So I'm just going to have a pop over to my browser, and please do let me know if you can't see this, but you should be able to see the homepage of the BBC. At the bottom here, you can see that there is this sticky cookie footer, which as I tab through, if I tab through from a little bit further down, we might be here a while. Really? Let's go way down. Right, okay. So as you can see, for anybody who wasn't quite sure what I was talking about when I was saying focus, when you are using the keyboard to move through any sort of web page, you can see that there is, in this case, a white focus indicator, which tells you where you are at all times. If I'm moving up a little bit, you can see that as you go through each of the particular well, they've changed it since I last looked at it. As it turns out, this is a bad example whereby you can see that there is a very slight focus indication here, but apart from that, you can't actually see anything below this cookie banner. But until literally yesterday, this was moving all the way down. So there is one button here that you can't see because of this cookie banner. So apologies for that. But this, when you are moving down with the focus, it does actually move down out of the way, with the exception of the very last item. One, I think, slightly more obvious issue in terms of this website is that there are buttons behind this cookie banner, whereby you can see here there is a partial view, which would obviously pass this success criteria. But if I get rid of that, there are other buttons behind it, like the cookie section settings, for example, whereby you wouldn't be able to see that with that cookie banner on top. So this would be a fail on the partial and the full focus not obscured requirement. So Alice, we're going to move over to you now to talk about dragging movements.
Thanks, Claire. Just before I do, I'll just see if anyone's got any questions on that one that you talked about. I'll just share my screen as well.
Can't see any questions, but please feel free to pop them in the Q&A if anything does occur. We can obviously come back to them at the end if anybody does suddenly have a question.
Definitely. Okay, I'll carry on with dragging movements for now. So the next criteria we're going to look at is 2.5.7 dragging movements, and this is a AA criteria. So this one says that all functionality that uses a dragging movement for operation can be achieved by a single pointer without dragging. So essentially, for any action that involves dragging, you need to have a single pointer alternative provided as well. And this is really important, as some people may not be able to use a mouse or a finger to drag an item. It does apply to things like drag and drop, for example, or sorting, or sliders, or movable widgets as well, like a chat window. And this dragging movements covered in this success criteria are pointer interactions where only the start and the end point matter. So if we think about a drag and drop, you grab an element from one location, like we have on the slide as an example, and then you drag it over and you move it to another location. So the point A there and the point B are the things that matter. The path of how you get there doesn't matter for this criteria, so that's not significant. This criteria does relate to desktop and mobile, so it does need to be considered on all those platforms. If dragging something is possible, so if you can drag something, you do need to have that alternative provided. This could be using a button to move an item from one place to another. But it could also be a drop down with options. So you could, like, if it's more complicated than just moving from A to B, maybe you have a drop down saying move to the bottom of a list, move to the top of the list, for example. Or it could even be an input field where you enter a value. And a case for this might be a color wheel, where you might be able to drag a pointer around the color wheel, but instead you can have an input field which would allow you to just input the value instead. So those are all kind of examples of that single pointer alternative. And it also doesn't have to be part of the same component, so it could be separate from it. So how can this actually be tested? What you want to essentially think about, as I've already mentioned, is if there is a dragging movement required, then look for that single pointer alternative. And I'm just going to show a good example and a not so good example as well, just to demonstrate this. So if we have a look here, we have a map. If I go and drag it, we can see I can drag it to the right, I can drag it to the left. And that is that dragging movement. As there is a dragging movement, we now want to think about, is there an alternative to that? Is there a single pointer alternative? And we can see on the right here, we do have this compass, which would allow me to do the same thing. So if I click on the right side, I can then move to the right. If I click to the left, I can move to the left. So this isn't relying on the dragging movement for me to be able to move around the map. I do have this compass, which allows me to do the same thing. In comparison, we have a map here as well. We can do the same thing here. I can move it across to the right, to the left, to the right, and I can drag it around. But if we then think, is there actually a single pointer alternative? There doesn't seem to be a single pointer alternative that would allow me to do that same functionality. So this is an example of where you'd want to make sure there is another way rather than just the dragging movement for your users to be able to navigate around. So there are some things where this doesn't apply. So it doesn't apply if the dragging is essential. So if you're scrolling a page, for example, or for system level gestures, so any browser gestures. And it is also crucially different to the keyboard requirement. So keyboard is one of the 2.0 guidelines, so it's been around for a while. This is different to this, as what keyboard requires is that it can be things that can be operated with a mouse can also be operated with a keyboard. This dragging movements requires that the drag can be achieved with a single pointer. And this also applies to touchscreen as well. So you also want it to be operable with a keyboard, but this is a different requirement. It's also different to pointer gestures, which is a 2.1 requirement, which you may be familiar with. And the pointer gestures requirement is about making sure that functionality that requires custom gestures can be operated with a single pointer. So for example, this could be tapping on the screen. So that's more thinking about the gesture that you have rather than the point of A and point B with this particular requirement. So just see if there's any questions on this one. Oh, I can see there's a question, which is, does it need to be an on-screen alternative, or could you use the arrow keys on the keyboard? Great question, thanks for that. So yeah, as I just mentioned with the keyboard requirement, this does apply to touchscreens as well. So you would need to make sure that you have that alternative there. So it does need to be a single pointer alternative, as it's not just for keyboard users, it's for lots of different users, including mobile users. Thanks for that question. Doesn't look like there's any other questions at this point on that one, so I'll hand back over to Claire, who will talk about the next one. Oh, sorry, there's just one more question that's come through, which is the alternative in the example is too small, which actually probably leads quite nicely onto your next one, Claire. So yes, that's another really good point. So there is a new requirement called target size, which Claire's just about to talk about. So I'll leave that one for Claire to answer next. Oh, I'll stop sharing the screen for you, Claire.
Thank you. Yeah, that keyboard question was one that we went back and forward on a little bit, Alice, before we found the answer. So very good question to ask. So yes, as Alice says, we're now going to talk about target size minimum. Again, this is one that has two versions. This is probably one of the more complex, I guess, new success criteria in WCAG 2.2, mainly because there are a large number of exemptions to it, but we will take them one by one and have a look. So there was actually, for those of you who are, aware and knowledgeable about WCAG 2.1, the version before this version of, sorry, I say WCAG where Alice says WCAG. So yes, there was a version of target size, which is a AAA version in WCAG 2.1, which actually asks for a larger target size than this one does. So this is the new requirement, which is called target size minimum, and that is at AA. So it basically means that says that the size of the target for pointer inputs, and that could be any number of things. It could be a mouse, it could be a finger, it could be an input device of an assistive technology. It says is at least 24 by 24 CSS pixels, which is actually in the grand old scheme of things, I'm sure if we've got designers on the call, we'll say that's actually quite a small target area. I believe the enhanced version is 44 by 44 CSS pixels, so it's double the size. And understandably, the reason for this is helping people, particularly using mobile devices, people who may have tremors and other physical impairments, as well as everybody really who may be in a shaky environment, on a train, anything like that, where you're trying, we've all been there, you're trying to touch that tiny little point or click on it, and it's just a very small target, so it's difficult to actually hit that target with your finger, your mouse. So as you can see on the screenshot, I've got a little example there which basically shows a target that would meet this requirement. It's 24 pixels by 24 pixels wide and long. As I said, this does have quite a few exemptions. The first of which is called spacing. So this success criteria doesn't just allow for having a target that is a specific size. It also says that if you have a target that isn't big enough, i.e. if it's, let's say it's 20 pixels by 20 pixels, it allows you to have a get out clause, if you will, whereby if there is enough space around that target, there's no overlap with other targets within that 24 pixel by 24 pixel box, then that is also allowed. So let me show you my next. So as you can see, the target has shrunk somewhat, so that it's 16 pixels by 16 pixels, but there is a 4 pixel gap between the target that we're looking at and the target that's next to it on the screen, which essentially means that you have a overall size of 24 pixels across, because obviously you have 4 pixels on either side, meaning that in this case, this would actually pass this success criteria by way of the spacing, exemption, because it's far enough away from any other targets that in this particular case, you're not going to be having that overlap. Second exemption is equivalent. It's one that's obviously used quite a lot within WCAG, in that if there is an alternative target or functionality that allows the user to achieve the same thing, and that one meets this particular requirement, then you're okay to have one that is undersized because there is an alternative where it meets the requirements and it does the same functionality. Another one that is quite common, I would have said, is the inline exemption. And as you can see on the screen, where there are, for example, in this case, there are 3 sets of links and they're one on top of each other. So these would not actually meet the 24 by 24 touch target requirement because they are within a block of text, so they're constrained by the height of that text. And this is another kind of exemption that you can have, which is basically where the line height of the surrounding text restricts the size of the target. So again, that is one that is allowed through an exemption. Then there are 2 others. One, which is where the user agent controls the size of the touch target. So, example, if you've just got a default radio button, that is the size of that is determined by the user agent. Therefore, you know, it's not within the requirements of this target size success criteria for that to meet those size requirements. And then the last one is, again, the essential, if the way that the target is presented is essential or is legally required. So as I say, this one is one where there are quite a few exemptions. I mean, anything that is 24 by 24 pixels is still quite a small one. As we'll talk about later, there is obviously a difference between adherence to WCAG in terms of compliance and best practice, whereby, you know, most touch targets would be significantly bigger than that. So we'll have a look at a couple of quick examples. This one is relevant on desktop and mobile, but we're just going to look at a couple of desktop examples for ease. So we're back with the BBC, and up here we have a search symbol, obviously for, you know, obviously searching within. As you can see, I have highlighted that, and you can see that it is 28 by 29 pixels. So this one fits comfortably within the requirements, and that it's a lot bigger than 24 by 24 pixels. So it's well within the range that we would expect. And then if we then go to, this is just down the road from me, the Brighton Centre. They also have a search item on their page, but as you can see, this is a 16 by 16 pixel. Apologies for the moving images. It's unfortunately not possible to pause it. That's a 16 by 16 pixel size touch target, but it has 16 by 16 space around it before it hits any other touch target. So that would meet the requirements under the spacing exemption. I appreciate this one is a bit complicated to get your head around because of, you know, the requirements, but also the number of exemptions. So please do pop any questions in the Q&A. I can see there are some. I think some of them will probably, oh, okay. So Darren, I'll come back to your query once I've finished on this section. So Raja, yes, so this is for desktop, well, this is for web pages, because the web content accessibility guidelines particularly are for web pages, although desktop applications, you should absolutely be putting that in. Depends on your definition of desktop application, I think. You should absolutely be adhering to these as well if you want to achieve, you know, true accessibility in terms of what you're putting together. And there is a one from Anonymous. Was there a minimum target size previously, or has the minimum size been updated? So there wasn't a minimum target size at AA level. There was a minimum target size at AAA, which is still there, which was for 44 by 44 CSS pixels. And this one has been put in as a minimum to kind of have that minimum level at AA. But in this case, I would strongly recommend trying to adhere to the AAA wherever you can to make your touch targets as usable as possible, even though this is the minimum level that you want to be looking at. And Alice, I'm going to move back over to you, and you can talk about consistent help.
Yeah, there's just one other question that came in.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Oh,
target
yes.
size.
Is this applicable via? Yes, it's applicable via any sort of thing that you would use to touch that target, basically, on either desktop or on mobile. So mouse pointer, keyboard, assistive technology, finger, anything that you could use to, you know, one of those little stylus things that people use on mobile phones sometimes. Anything like that, that's what this is applicable for.
Thanks, Claire. So we're now going to move on to the next success criteria that we're going to talk about, which is 3.2.6 consistent help. And this is a level A criteria. So this one says that if a web page contains help mechanisms and those mechanisms are repeated on multiple web pages within a set of web pages, they occur in the same relative order to other page content unless a change is initiated by the user. There's quite a lot to think about there, but this one's actually one of the more straightforward ones to think about. So essentially what it's saying is you want to put help in the same place when it's on multiple pages. And this is because it can help people who need to find help find it more easily if it's in the same place. And this does apply to both desktop and mobile as well. One thing to remember, though, is that it doesn't require help mechanisms are provided. But it does require that when they are provided, they're in the same location across a set of pages. So a few things to think about here. Firstly, what's meant by the same place? So this would refer to the same relative order. So for example, if you have programmatically put it in the footer, so within your code, your help button is sitting in the footer. On one page, you'd also want to make sure it's programmatically in that place on the next page. So this is because a keyboard user, for example, or a screen reader user, when they're navigating through the page, they navigate through the DOM. So that is the programmatic order of the page. So even though visually, like the example we've got on the slide, we've got a chat button that's floating in the bottom right, even though visually it might always be in the bottom right, you want to make sure that it's programmatically in the same place as well. We also want to think about what is a help mechanism as well. So there are different types of help mechanism, which could be on the page or via a link to a different page. So an example of a help mechanism could be human contact details. So this could be an email address or a phone number, for example. It could be a human contact mechanism. So this could be live chat with a person. It could just be self-help options. So again, on the screen, we've got help and support. There could be a link to a FAQ page or a how do I do something page. Or it could be a fully automated contact mechanism like a automated chat bot. As I mentioned, the help can be on the page itself, or it can be just directing a link. So it could be linking you to a help center or something. If it's human help and it's only available at set times, so for example, you might have a live help by chat, but only available between 9 and 5. Make the user aware of that as well. And that's not a requirement, it's just a kind of best practice consideration. And this also only applies to a set of pages as well. So this is essentially user journeys. So when you're thinking about this part of it, think about what you're kind of doing in that set of pages. So you might be looking at a news story, and then there might be a link that directs you to a completely different website. This would be considered 2 distinct journeys. So the help wouldn't need to be in the same place across both of those. But if you were looking at a news story and you went to another news story on the same site or back to the homepage, for example, the help would need to be in the same place on those pages. So I'll just show some examples of this now, just to demo this requirement. So if I just go here, so firstly, this is the justgov.uk website. In the footer, we do have a help link here. So that's available in the footer for the user. If you go to a different page, so if we went to the help page itself, the help is still in the same location in the footer. This has taken, the help itself is not on the page, it's giving you a direct link to that page. So this would be an acceptable example. If you were taken away from this page, so for example, if it linked you to a different site or to additional information that was provided by some not provided by gov.uk, then that would be considered a different set of pages and a different journey to think about. As another example, on this one, on queries, we have the live chat bot at the bottom. So this is sticky in the corner here. This is always there on this page. If I were to go to a different page, we can see that on this page, it appears as well, and it's still in that same location. So visually, it's the same place, but as I mentioned before, you need to make sure it's programmatically in the same place as well. So within the DOM, within your code, if this is actually sat within the header and positioned down here visually, you want to make sure it's always in the header on the different pages. Or if it's in the footer, similarly, you want to make sure it's always in the footer across those different pages. And then just as another example here, in the footer here, we have an FAQ link. So we have a section called help. Again, similar to the gov.uk one, it's a link to a different page. So the help itself is not directly provided on the page, but it is provided on a different page. And this example is a way to provide that self-help. So it's those frequently asked questions. However, here we are currently on the homeware home accessories page. But if I were to go to the checkout, for example, or log in, so if I log in and click login, this is now taking me to a different page, and that footer is no longer there. I no longer have that FAQ option. However, in this example, because it's part of a different journey and it's a different set of pages, this would still pass because it's out of scope to be on this page as well. However, within this page, if I were to click between the different product sections, I would expect that FAQ to always be in the footer in that section. So that's there's just one other thing to consider on consistent help, which is the order is also restricted to your zoom level or your viewport or the orientation of your device. So for example, if the location of the help changes when you're viewing it on mobile versus when you're viewing it on desktop, this is considered a change initiated by the user, so it would be out of scope. You just want to think about where it is when you're looking at on mobile and then the set of pages. Similarly, you want to think about where it is on desktop and then where it is within that set of pages. But yeah, I'll just check the Q&A before handing over to Claire. I can see his question that are there exceptions where chat sometimes pops up in the middle of the screen, for example, for form completion or quote journeys? That's a really good question, actually. That's so I guess if it was similar to what we have on the screen at the moment, so they kind of pop up in the right-hand corner, then that's something that you'd want to make sure it was in the same place on the different page. But that's a really good question about if it pops up as you're actually going through the journey. Claire, I don't know if you've got any suggestions for that one. Otherwise, we might need to go away and have a think about that one.
I mean, I think the only thing that I can think of right now is obviously if it happens across a set of web pages, because obviously consistent help is only relevant if that help mechanism is repeated across multiple web pages. But yeah, I don't know what the I guess if it was only coming up once at one point in one page, then it wouldn't be within the criterion's kind of scope. But if it was popping up at the same, I guess, point on multiple pages, then yes, you would need to make sure that it was in the same relative order on the, I guess, in the DOM, but also when it happens, if you see what I mean. It's quite, yeah, I'm not sure, to tell you the truth. It's quite, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, I guess the example on it was form completion, which suggests it would be a one-off pop-up. So from that, it sounds like it'd be out of scope for this requirement. But then it says, this is for isolated journeys, just trying to see the cutoff compromise here for best practice. So yeah, I guess if it's, like Claire was saying, if it's appearing, and maybe you have a checkout, and if it's a thing that's appearing like, do you need help on every page at a certain point, then I'd probably imagine that this would need to meet that requirement. The issue the site also, sorry, there's just an extra bit of the issue the site also have chatbot that appears in other pages in different locations. Yeah, I guess those probably are two separate bits of help. So it would depend on that if there's already a chatbot, that would be treated separately to this one, I'd imagine, from what you've described. But yeah, thank you for that. That's a really interesting question there. So I'll now hand back over to Claire, who's going to chat about the next one. And I'll just stop sharing my screen. There you go, Claire.
Right, sorry about that. Just realised I was on mute. So we have now moved on to redundant entry. And as Alice mentioned towards the beginning of the webinar, there are a certain number of criteria that have been particularly put in to help people with cognitive impairments and learning disabilities, and consistent help is one of those, but redundant entry, and also the one that Alice is going to talk about next, which is accessible authentication, are kind of, those three are quite specific towards people with cognitive disabilities, and redundant entry is very much particularly for those with memory impairments, but also people with mobility impairments, not having to enter data in as much. So redundant entry basically says that information that has been previously entered or provided by the user within a process doesn't need to be entered again if the information is required again within the same process. It's either auto-populated or it's available for the user to select. And again, this is one of the success criteria that is obviously aims at specific user profiles, but is also fantastic for everybody else, because I know from my own point of view, and certainly I'm sure a lot of people feel this way, that if you have to put the same information in again and again within a process, it's quite frustrating and annoying. One thing to kind of to point out, which is outside of compliance, but there is kind of anecdotal evidence that making processes easier, for example, via redundant entry, means that conversion rates for sign up, e-commerce, other transactions are likely to increase. The easier you make things, the more likely people are to see them through to the end, which is obviously not about compliance, but just a little bit of helpful information there. So there are many ways that you can meet this requirement. Some examples: you can have autocomplete, whereby the system takes information that's already been put in and automatically puts it into the next time that it's required. So if you've already put in your name and address, it auto completes your name and address the next time that's required. We should point out that having the browser autocomplete, so for example, you've got the autocomplete attribute in an input field, doesn't count for compliance with the success criteria. Having the option to select from a drop down, so if you've got multiple addresses in a system, a home or a business address, you can select one from a drop down that's already been populated. Being able to take something from another part of the page and copy and paste it into the next section that's required is also a good way of doing it. And another example is having a checkbox, which basically says, do you want to use this information again? I think the one that most people will be kind of familiar with is when you're using your shipping address for your billing address, which is an example I've got on this slide. There's a checkbox for a billing address that says use my shipping address. You can check that and it automatically populates everything through. There's one thing to note, that the information that is put in within the process doesn't need to be stored. So if the user closes the process and comes back, they can be asked to re-enter their information. But within the process itself, that information needs to be available for them to select rather than having to put it in again. Another example, which is probably one that is less thought of, is if you are doing a search, for example, Google. This is actually, this one on the slide doing search results for disability is actually from our website. And when you get the results, the search field has that search term already in there. So if you want to then add some more search terms, you don't have to put disability in again. So if you have your search terms and you want to filter them even more and add some more search terms, you can do that without having to re-enter what you've already searched for. And as with, you know, a lot of the other criteria, there are exemptions. So when putting stuff in again is essential. For example, a memory game, obviously it wouldn't be very effective as a memory game if it gave you the answers as you were going along, where the information is required to ensure the security of the content. So for example, using stars for passcodes and not letting them be copied, that's a valid exemption. And also where the previously entered information is no longer valid. So for example, if you're changing your address, you obviously don't want to have that information put in again because you want to put your new address in. And again, this applies to desktop and mobile. So whichever way you're looking at it, you know, responsive or native mobile, this is a requirement. Have a quick look at a couple of examples. So as we mentioned, we've already got having the shipping address, and then as you can see, when I want to pay, it says I've got a billing address down here and it says use my shipping address, and it then auto populates what I've already put in the previous screen. Oops. And then the second of these is actually from a summary of information that I input when I was buying pet insurance, an example. The details of the pet that had been put in and the user were presented with an edit button so that I could change any errors. So when there was any information that had to be put into a third party, that was already available for me to edit if needed. And I can see there are a few things in the Q&A, so I'll have a quick look. I'm assuming that the question here, it says this may require a review of any privacy notices, although legal purpose should cover this. Obviously, we can't give information on the kind of legal side of things. I think it would be very much a case of you would need to talk to the relevant people in your organisations in terms of meeting accessibility compliance, and it would be specific to your own organisation in terms of that, I'm afraid. And then we've got would form fields that ask you to enter your email address twice to confirm it's been entered correctly be exempt from this guideline? It's a very good question, and I'm not sure, in all honesty. I think that is one that maybe Alice, have you got any thoughts on that? I think my initial I'll ask you because I know what my initial reaction is, but I don't want to say it if it's might not be.
I believe
correct.
this is specifically listed in the official documentation for confirm email address field. I can't remember off the top of my head what the answer is for that one.
I'll have a look and see if I can find it whilst you're talking about accessible authentication.
Fab, that'd be great. But yeah, I think that is one that was discussed around like how best to conform to that.
And then we've just got a couple more for search example. How many previous searches should be saved? I mean, I would say just the previous one, but again, I can look at that one to see if there is any particular wording on that from the W3C. Any limitations like CVV details or OTP? I suspect that would be an exemption under essential, but I think that would probably be something you'd need to talk to your security/legal people about, because it's something that is kind of blurs the line between accessibility versus legal, I think, a little bit. So let me have a look, but I suspect that that is a question you'd need to ask your security people about how they would work with the accessibility requirements against any security requirements. I will just stop sharing so that you can move on, Alice, but I'll have a look and see if I can find any relevant answers to those questions, and we'll pop something in the chat for anybody. Sorry, carry on, Alice.
Lovely, thanks, Claire. I can see there's a few other bits in the chat as well, but we can always come back to any questions at the end as well. We're now going to move on to the final criteria that we're going to talk about today, and probably one of the most complicated ones as well, which is 3.3.8 accessible authentication minimum, and this is a AA requirement. There is also a related AAA requirement, which doesn't have which has certain parts of it that aren't included. But yeah, the one we're going to talk about today is the AA requirement. So this says that a cognitive function test is not required for any step in an authentication process unless that set provides at least one of the following, and that's an alternative, a mechanism, object recognition, or personal content. So for this one, we don't want to make people solve or recall or transcribe something to authorize a login or a payment, as some people with cognitive disabilities, for example, may not be able to solve puzzles or memorize login details or retype one-time passwords, for example. So there's a few bits that we can break down in this to kind of understand this requirement better. So firstly, if we think about what is a cognitive function test, so we can define this as a task that requires the user to remember, manipulate, or transcribe information. Examples include things like remembering a password or solving a puzzle, but it could be other forms of memorizing information. So remembering a set of characters or images or patterns, for example. It could also be transcription, so transcribing, typing out some letters, or it could be performing a calculation, so the 1 + 2 = and then adding that sum tests. We also want to think about what actually is an authentication process as well. So we can define this as a process where you're confirming your identity. So this could be logging into an account, be it a shopping account or online banking or any type of account. Or it could be logging into your device, so entering a PIN onto your device to log in. Or it could be verifying your identity to make a payment. Or it could be even recovering your email address and password, so the forgotten password journey. So the things we want to think about are that there needs to be at least one of the following, so alternative, mechanism, object recognition, and personal content. So if you first think about what is meant by alternative, this is to make sure that there is another authentication method that does not rely on a cognitive function test. So this could be a QR code, just as an alternative example. Or there should be a mechanism. So this mechanism should be available to assist the user to complete that cognitive function test. So for example, if the user was being asked for their password, there could be support for password entry from a third-party manager, or it could be the ability to copy and paste that password, or it could be biometrics on a mobile phone, so Face ID, for example. Or this, if the cognitive function test is to recognize objects, then this would be sufficient. And similarly, if the cognitive function test is to identify non-text content that the user's provided, then that would also meet this requirement. So, for example, if they've uploaded an image and been asked to identify that, that would be a pass for this. So as I mentioned, there is a AAA criteria. This doesn't allow object recognition or personal content to be used. And this is the enhanced version of this criteria. So to help kind of explain this, there's here's some example conformance for 3.3.8. So if we look at the first example on the left, we have a password field. The user's being required to enter their password here to sign in. However, below the sign in, there is also a sign in with a verification link. What this can do is essentially sends something to email, and you can click on a link in your email, and this can log you in instead of you having to write a password. So that's an example of an alternative way of logging in. You could also use a trusted device. So for example, you might have an app on a mobile device, which the user can confirm that they are attempting to access their account or make a payment or something. You could use biometrics, so fingerprint or facial recognition. So in the example in the middle, there's a PIN code required to enter a platform. But also in the bottom left, we have the Face ID button. So the user is not required to remember their PIN to be able to get into this platform. They could use Face ID instead. And then the final example on the right, we have an email or mobile number field. There's a icon on the right-hand side, which is for a third-party password manager. So this would allow the user to pre-fill from that. Or there's also an alternative available as well. So there's kind of two options here. It's giving the user choice around maybe they don't have the password stored in a third-party manager. And so it's given them an option of having a one-time code instead. This criteria does apply to every stage in the authentication process. So if it's OTP, PIN entry, it does apply to all the different stages. However, it doesn't apply to the initial registration process. So if you're signing up for a new service and you're entering details, it wouldn't apply to this. If you're using multi-factor authentication, where you might have an OTP sent to a device, for example, you want to make sure that it's possible to copy and paste that passcode from that secondary device to the input field. Or for example, if you have an email, then send that email to the primary device for copy and paste into an input field. So what I mean by that is, if we look at this example on the right, if the user chose to log in with a one-time passcode and that passcode was going to be sent to their mobile number, but the user was actually on their desktop device, then there wouldn't actually be that option to copy and paste. They'd have to transcribe it from their mobile device into this input field on their desktop. However, if they had entered their email and that email had been sent a one-time code, they could copy and paste that from their email into that field. So you do need to think about how that happens. How it happens is out of scope for the success criteria. It only requires that the passcode can be copied into the field. And also think about, make sure there's enough time for the code being provided for the users to actually input it. So if it's a one-time password with a time limit, just making sure your users have enough time to actually put that in. It's also important to note it isn't necessary to provide all of these options. So this example on the right, we have the option to the third-party manager and the one-time code. You don't need to provide all these options. The success criteria only requires that one of these is made available. So wherever a cognitive function test is required, there must be at least one method that passes. And this, again, is for every step in the authentication process. But it's also really good to give your user choice of how they receive that information. So you don't know how a user's accessing the content. Again, if we think about the email and the mobile example, they may be on desktop, they may be on a mobile device, you don't know how they're going to use it. So providing different options gives your users choice. There's also a caveat for banks as well. So it may be difficult to meet the accessible authentication requirements and the legal requirements for banks. The examples that we're kind of talking about today cover the accessibility side, and as Claire's already mentioned, we wouldn't be able to advise on any of the financial legalities of that either. So we're now just going to go through examples, and this is your opportunity to see if you how well you understand this criteria. So we're going to start with some examples, and if there's going to be a poll that pops up on the screen. What do you think? Do you think that these would pass the criteria? So for this one, this is a password entry field with drop downs for the first, second, and sixth digit. Would this pass the 3.3.8 criteria? And the options are yes, no, or you're not sure. Just give you a second for that one. Okay, please could we end the poll for that one? Fantastic. So 31% of you said yes, it would pass. 64% of you said no, and 5% of you said you weren't sure. Fantastic. So yes, this is an example of a failure. And that's because it requires the user to select from a drop down. So even if there's no way to copy and paste a passcode here, there's no alternative that we can see to this. So this is requiring the user to remember their password and select from a drop down. So this would be an example of a failure of this criteria. Now, if we move on to the next one, again, would this pass 3.3.8? And in this example, we have an OTP field with 6 separate input fields, and the OTP has been sent to a mobile phone number. And let's assume that this has gone to this is being accessed on a mobile device as well. Just give another few seconds for that. And could we end the poll, please? Thank you. So 66% of you said yes, 22% of you said no, and 12% of you said not sure. Yes, so this would be an example of this would pass. However, there would be some things to think about here. So we're saying it would pass, but this is assuming that you can, it allows copy and paste on the phone. So you'd want to make sure that if the user's accessing it on a phone device and then they're getting the number to their mobile phone, that they can then, that then pre-populates for them. Again, if they were accessing this on the desktop platform and the code was sent to their phone, this would be a failure if that was the only way of doing it, because they'd have to transcribe that information. And similarly, if they were on a mobile device and it came to their phone, but they couldn't actually copy, they couldn't actually pre-populate those fields, then that would be a failure as well. So lots of things to kind of think about with this, but this could pass if those requirements were met. And again, as I mentioned, do give your users choice as well. So think about how they could receive the information. The providing different ways may be beneficial to them. And then this is just an example of one where in this example, it's similar to the first example we looked at, where the user's been required to enter the following characters to log on. But then it's using input fields rather than drop downs. So in this example, this could potentially pass if it allows the user to copy and paste into those fields. But also, if there was an alternative provided, then it wouldn't matter if this passed because there was that alternative. Obviously, ideally, both would pass, but if the user could log in with Face ID on their phone, then that would be a sufficient alternative. However, again, think about is it the same way that they log in on desktop as well? And is there that alternative available there? So just an example of one where that top option could pass if you had a different way of, if it was designed differently or built differently. And then we've got another option. So this is another one where we've got a poll. For this one, would this pass 3.3.8? And for this one, we have a capture field, which is requesting that the user selects the traffic light squares. So I'll just give you a second for that one. And can we end the poll, please? Fantastic. Yeah, so 33% of you said yes, 56% of you said no, and 10% of you said not sure. So for this one, this would pass, and this is because it relies on object recognition. If you wanted to meet the AAA requirement, then this wouldn't pass because it doesn't allow that object recognition exemption. There are some cases where capture would fail. So, for example, if it relies on remembering a word or a number, or if you need to type the word that's in a picture, for example. Or if it relies on more than just object recognition. So, for example, if it's a sum you need to complete as well. But this particular example is relying on object recognition, so this would pass this criteria. And then we have one more final example. So for this one, would this pass 3.3.8? And for this one, we have an OTP field with one input or option to enter the password, and the OTP has been sent to an email. Just give you a second for that. Please, could we end the poll? Thank you very much. So yeah, for this one, 82% of you said yes, 12% of you said no, and 6% of you said not sure. Fantastic, yes. So for this one, this would pass, or we can assume it passes. That's because firstly, code was sent to an email, so that could be accessed on different devices, and that could then be entered into that input field. We are, of course, assuming that it's allowing copy and paste. You want to make sure that you're not blocking copy and paste from your users. So if this did block it, that could fail. However, even if it did block it, we do have that alternative anyway. So there is that option to enter my Zoom panel's missing the word password, enter password instead. So there is that alternative. Maybe that enter password instead field is not relying on OTP and actually would allow you to copy and paste or enter it from a password manager. So it's just making sure that one of those methods works and meets the requirements. But of course, ideally, you'd want all your different methods to work if they can. So thank you very much for that, everyone. I hope you found that useful to kind of go through those examples. We'll just quickly run through some other example failures. So requiring the user to enter a password or code in a different format from the original, for example, by requesting a user to enter the first, second, and sixth characters of a password would be a failure. Or having a password input that requires a user to select each character of a fixed length password from individual drop-down fields would also be a failure. Blocking the user from being able to paste a password into a password field is a failure. So even if you can copy them, if you can copy it, you need to be able to paste it as well. But also blocking the use of integrated third-party password managers into input fields could fail. And having to manually transcribe a passcode from a secondary device, such as a card reader. So again, that's been sent to a device where you'd need, regardless of whether you're accessing it on a mobile, tablet, or desktop, you would need to be able to, you'd have to transcribe that in that example. So I'll just check if there's any questions before handing over to Claire. I can just see there's a comment of, it feels like a real challenge to keep authentication secure and still meet accessibility requirements. Absolutely, yes, there are lots and lots of things to think about with this criteria, but it's important to think about there are different ways that you can meet it. So there's alternative, you can use copy and paste, things like that, and also only one of them needs to pass. Again, ideally they all would, but making sure that you have that one method is the key requirement for this for this criteria. And I just see another question here. So sorry, read the capture. How does the headphone symbol work with the capture image? Would the option to have a traffic lights box read out to not make this AAA? Really good question. I hadn't actually noticed the headphones one on that particular one. So that one does meet it anyway, because it is that object recognition. But regarding the headphones, that's a good question about the AAA. I don't know, Claire, do you know if that would meet the AAA requirements? I guess it is an alternative there.
I think because it's still technically object recognition, even if you're recognizing it with your ears rather than your eyes, unless I'm missing the point of the question, then yeah, because object recognition isn't allowed at AAA, possibly, but
that's
again,
a good point.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones where a lot of people will ask that question. It's just finding the answer, but I suspect that it would still be classified as object recognition.
Yes, that's a really good point. Yeah. So yeah, if it's, I guess even if it's audio, you're still having to recognize the object. So yeah. Great. So I'll now hand back to Claire, who will talk about going beyond 2.2. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Oh, hello. That's not right. Apologies. So we're now just going to talk briefly about kind of beyond 2.2. Obviously, that's something that's happened, and for anybody who's been waiting for WCAG 2.2, it's been a bit of a wait, obviously, for it to come through. But the W3C have been kind of looking beyond WCAG 2.2 for some time. The first thing to kind of mention, and a lot of people who work in accessibility will already be kind of aware of this, is looking at WCAG 3.0, which is essentially the next evolution of the accessibility guidelines. They will basically undergo a complete restructure, and the aim is to make them kind of easier to understand, address more user needs, but also address different types of web content, apps, tools, organizations. One of the, I guess, slight restrictions in the way that WCAG is structured at the moment is that it is highly technical and very focused on web content, although obviously it's applied to a lot of different other things, including apps, etc. And the way that WCAG 3 will be structured will be quite different, but it will have the same goal as WCAG 2.2. Obviously, the accessibility guidelines for content and apps with the specific accessibility requirements, but it will have a different structure, a different performance model, and looking at a broader scope just beyond web content, as I said. So the conformance levels at the moment, as we know, are A, AA and AAA, and that will change to bronze, which will be essentially the minimum conformance. If you meet bronze, then you are at the conformance level for WCAG 3.0. Silver will incentivize organizations to kind of go further to improve accessibility. And then gold will be awarded to organizations that are, kind of exemplary role models. One of the ways in which they will hope to have, kind of conformance is through something called assertions, which will be a formal claim of fact from an organization, which can be used to support conformance. For example, evidence of training, usability testing, assistive technology testing. So it will be quite beyond the kind of yes, no statements that are currently the way that WCAG works. Although it has to be said that it is unlikely that WCAG 3 will be released before the end of this decade, is the last update. The most recent draft was released in July, but it was quite stripped back. Updated drafts are expected every 3 to 6 months, but as I say, it's several years away before WCAG 3 will be put in place. Moving on, as I'm aware of the time, one of those things to kind of think about is user research, best practice. As I said, WCAG, there are some restrictions due to its quite technical pass-fail nature. One thing to say is with user research, anybody who's already doing user research will know this, but it gives you a deeper understanding of accessibility issues from specific users' perspective, rather than, as I say, the very technical accessibility compliance. It also gives you kind of more practical insight into the site's usability for people with disabilities. And it's something to complement your WCAG, or give you kind of a more comprehensive accessibility evaluation. And then the last thing I'd like to kind of talk you through is looking at WCAG 2.2 and user research as, together as complementary things that you can do to really get to know your users and, their accessibility requirements. So this is an example of a user that one of my colleagues came up with, who is called Jordan. He's a 55-year-old retired headmaster, and he has Parkinson's, which impacts his movement, gives him tremors. He has difficulty with fine motor control, and he also has impairments with his attention and memory. He loves cooking, he loves spending time with his family, he's very independent, but he has a lot of challenges when he's using online platforms for shopping, due to his Parkinson's and its kind of side effects. Just a couple of thoughts on where those new WCAG 2.2 success criteria are implemented and how they can help someone like Jordan. If you're implementing Focus Not Obscure, Jordan regularly uses a keyboard to navigate and interact with the web content because of his worsening tremors, and also using a mouse places quite a lot of stress on his hand. So obviously having this Focus Not Obscured really helps him to see where he is on the screen all the time and interact with the website better. Because of his tremors, he frequently will miss-hit targets. An example, hitting a clear button instead of a checkout with a shopping cart means that, possibly hours of careful putting things into his basket have gone in a single click. Putting in target size helps to minimize that likelihood that he'll hit the wrong button, particularly if he's using his tablet, which is when he's using his fingers, and obviously with his tremors and his fine motor control, that will definitely help him to avoid that kind of frustration of hitting the wrong button. Talking about redundant entry and accessible authentication, I get kind of together with his problems with his fine motor control, and also with his memory becoming less reliable, and also having an attention impairment, means that with redundant entry, he doesn't have to go through the physical and mental effort of entering information twice. Accessible authentication means that he can manage his banking, other important tasks safely, but also independently by using things like password managers, in order to make sure that he's got the ability to carry on doing as much as he can on his own, without having to ask his family for help. So very obviously a bit of a sprint through that one, but it does give you hopefully a little taster of how these new criteria being put into place can help people in the real world. And I'm aware we're at time, but we may have time maybe for one or two of the questions. I can see. Okay, so we've got somebody saying, is bronze, silver and gold replacing A, AA and AAA? Yes, so sorry, I probably didn't word that well. So those will replace those new bronze, silver and gold levels as it's envisaged at the moment, will replace A, AA and AAA, but it won't be a like for like. So it won't be that bronze is A, silver is AA and gold is AAA. It will be a completely new way of conformance and looking at how things are certified as being accessible. And then we've got Roger saying, these 13 guidelines fall under which categories? Do we have the categorization for WCAG 2.2? So that the 13 guidelines fall under those 4 principles that Alice was talking about. And then within those 13 guidelines are the 86 success criteria. So if you go to the WCAG 2.2 website, which I can pop in here, you can see how everything, I'll give you the understanding one because it's a bit easier to digest. You can see how it all kind of comes together. And Ian has said, thank you very much for taking the time to prepare and deliver this session. It's been useful and interesting. I'm really, really glad to hear that. And yes, obviously, if you want to get in contact with our sales colleagues for any help on any of this, then absolutely, we're here to help. And I think that I'm going to hand back, I think, to, is it Kelly, are you still there to finish up for us?
Hiya, yes, I am. Thank you. So thank you so much, Claire and Alice, for that very informative session on WCAG 2.2. And thank you to everyone who's participated. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, any unanswered questions we'll look to answer online in the next few days, but from just monitoring the Q&A, it looks like we managed to get every single one, but you will be receiving a feedback form where you can add any last questions that you might think of after this webinar. So please fill that out and add any last minute questions there. But if you do have any questions or would like to find out further on how we can help you conform with WCAG or WCAG, please reach out to your main sales contact. Alternatively, you can email our central inbox at the following email address, sales@abilitynet.org.uk. We also have an e-newsletter which you can sign up to at abilitynet.org.uk/newsletter to receive news about the free resources we offer. So once again, thank you so much, Claire and Alice, and everyone who's joined us today. Fill out that feedback form, add any last questions, and just let us know how you found the session. But otherwise, we'll be in touch very soon. So thank you and bye everyone.
Thanks all, bye.
Thank you.